Hi guys, today in class we started with an entrance ticket. So if you would go to week 6, the date is 9/21. The title is Entrance Ticket, Domain and Range. If you would open and complete that, there are 3 problems to work on. Just in quickly explaining our entrance ticket, the first problem, it was talking about domain, so I know that is the X values, right? I was able to cross out answer choice B and D because those had the letter Y, right? So then I'm left with X is greater than or equal to -2, X is greater than or equal to 4.5. If you notice, okay, my endpoint, if I drew it down to meet my X-axis, my endpoint would be at -2 on the X-axis. So that is why we picked answer choice A. Okay, second question, it wants us to find the domain. Okay, so it is talking about the X-axis again, right? Our endpoints, right, if we drew them down to see where they would touch my X-axis, they would be at -1 all the way to include up to point 3 on my X-axis, right? I crossed out B and D because those had Y as an answer choice. That is our range, right? The correct answer is A because it did go from -1 to 3. Okay, and question number 3 was a range problem. Now we're talking about the Y-axis. Okay, so I was able to cross out A and D because those were related to the X or your domain, right? So if we go and look at our endpoint, it is landing between 200,000 and 300,000. Okay, that means that my range has to be anything greater than 250,000. Okay, there is no stopping point right here. The arrow means that it keeps going in the positive direction. Okay, the next thing we did from here was take some notes on domain and range word problems. Okay, RW's real world situations. When we were done taking notes, we went and opened up our Jamboard assignment for today. But we're going to go ahead and take some notes right now. Okay, so the notes that we took, today's date, 9/21. We were talking about domain and range word problems. Or we call these the real world situations. Okay, so our checklist, we're going to read carefully. Okay, I would underline keywords, I would circle important things, you can highlight, right? Anything that you think is important for you to know or understand from the word problem. Okay, your second step, you're going to organize your information. The best way to do that is to create a T-chart or a table, right? So that way you can separate your ideas and try to formulate your independent and your dependent variables. Okay, step 3, is it continuous or discrete? Depending on the way you organize your information and what you're given, right, will help you determine whether you have to use continuous numbers and inequalities or if you have to use discrete data, right, and whole numbers. Okay, step 4 is to make if-then statements. Or statement, I'm sorry. This is the cause and effect. If this happens, then this can happen, right? So one has to happen before the other can happen. Fifth step, if is your X, that is the domain. Then is your y, or your range. Okay, our if statement is what we call our independent variable. That means that this one is going to happen no matter what. It is going to keep increasing or decreasing regardless of what's happening, right? Then our range is what we call our dependent. It depends on something before it can happen. Okay, so just setting up a little table so we can help remind ourselves, right? We already had done the D and the R for domain and range. We're going to add the ID. So when we think of Dr. ID, we set it up like a table. They align with the column that they belong in. Okay, if we see F parentheses X, we do not say F times X. We do not say F parentheses X, close parentheses, right? It reads F of X. Okay, this is what we call function notation. Okay, when we see this, F of X is the same thing as Y, right? So when we start seeing tables set up, okay, another little table for yourself, you will have the X column labeled. You might see F of X on the top of the Y column, right? F of X, remember, is the same thing as Y. Okay, so for example, if we see H of T, right? That's how we read it. The letter inside the parentheses is going to be my X. So it'll be the left side of the table or it'll be on the X column. That is our independent variable. That has to happen first before we can figure out what our Y is, right? The independent is our domain. H of T, this whole thing is my Y, or my dependent. If X happens, then Y can happen. Okay, we are going to go to our week 6, 921, the Jamboard for today, domain and range, real world domain and range problems. Let's go ahead and go open that. Okay, so I read through this problem, slide 1, and the important things that I pointed out were 2 days before the plant was bought. Okay, your plant had started growing, right? She had it for 98 days until it died. Okay, the tallest plant, or the tallest point of the plant, was 30 centimeters tall. Okay, but if we notice, let's look right here, my H of T, okay, remember the variable inside of the parentheses, right, the letter T, is going to be my X column. So when I'm setting up my problem, right, when I'm organizing my information, it tells me that T stands for days, right? T stands for days. So underneath my X column, it seems as though we want to start with -2, right? But we cannot have -2 days, okay? So we start with 0, okay? The domain is talking about your X, right? So that's what it wants to know. If we start at 0, right, for my X, which talks about days, right? X is talking about days. The only two that could work are B and C, right? B works, okay, because it goes up to 100 days. And then the 30 does not work for me because that one is talking about how tall the plant is, right? Remember, our domain only talked about days. Okay. Okay, on slide number 2, the important words that I read were altitude effects. So I had automatically thought that altitude was my X column or my X side, right? Okay, then I read further and I said 198 seconds to boil at the altitude of negative 418 meters, right? So that already gave me an idea of how I could set up my information. Okay, so altitude was my X column. Y was my seconds, right? So that's how I set it up. Negative 418 was under my X column because that was my altitude. And then I put 198 under my Y column because that talked about my seconds, right? How long it took. Okay, then I read further down and I said the altitude of 8,848 meters, right? It takes 209 seconds to boil it there, right? So I took my 8,848 and I put that under my X column for my altitude. I put the 209 seconds under my Y column, okay? So if we look here, T of A, remember the letter inside my parentheses tells me my X column on the table or my X axis, right? So A tells me altitude. I was right by putting the altitude as my X, right? So if we organize that information, my X or my altitude can go from negative 418 all the way to 8,848. So that is why answer choice D is correct and not A. A talks about 209, but 209 was my seconds, right? You are responsible for completing slides number 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 needs to be written out. So you have to organize your information and see how you need to be counting your domain and how you need to be counting your range. Okay? Number 8, number 9, and slide number 10. 11, you are done. Submit your work.